We know a whole lot about the physiology of respiration right now, but there's one thing we haven't talked about yet, and that is how does your body know how frequently to do this thing that we call breathing? There are times like right now where you might be taking a single breath every 10 seconds. You're not thinking about it at all. But if you were running, you might be taking a breath every 2 seconds, right? And if I asked you when you just got done running a 100-yard dash to please stop breathing so fast, you'd go, yeah, right. Like you're not in control of that. And yet there are other times when I can ask you, here, breathe now, inhale now, and you could do that. This seems kind of complicated, and it is. Now, your breathing is very different from your heart rate. Your heart rate goes faster and slower depending on your exercise, but you're not in charge of your heart rate at all. Your breathing will get faster and slower, and yet you also could be in charge of it. And one of the reasons for this is because of the complicated interface between your conscious mind and your brain stem. Now, your brain stem is pretty complicated when it comes to breathing. We're not going to talk about most of it. I want us to focus right now on this area of the brain stem called the medulla oblongata. The medulla oblongata is mostly responsible for the breathing that you do while you're just sitting there not thinking about it, right? And it is true that your mind, your conscious mind, can tell the medulla oblongata to convey your wishes to your diaphragm so you can be in control of it consciously. But most of the time, this is unconscious. One of the other things that's very different about breathing and the heart rate is if I were to cut all of the nerves going to your heart would still beat. But if I were to cut the nerves going to your diaphragm, you would no longer be able to breathe. And that's why this is in bright yellow. Breathing depends on repetitive stimuli from the brain, which means there needs to be a nerve connecting the medulla oblongata to your diaphragm. And when an action potential gets sent down that nerve, the phrenic nerve, then it'll cause the diaphragm to contract. Now, that means the medulla oblongata is responsible for deciding, now's the time for you to take a breath. How does that happen? Well, first of all, I want to make this point really strongly. It doesn't matter how many times I say it, about half the class gets this wrong, so don't let that be you, all right? Breathing is not regulated by the amount of oxygen in your blood. I know. It feels like it should be, right? Isn't that why we're breathing? Yes, that's why we're breathing. We're breathing so we can get enough oxygen in our blood. Then why in the world is it that the rate at which we breathe is not dependent on the amount of oxygen in our blood? The reason that it's not is that oxygen does not dissolve well in water, which makes the amount of oxygen in your blood very difficult for your body to measure moment by moment. Now, we've got pulse oximeters that can measure the amount of oxygen in your blood really accurately, but it does it by using light waves, right? Your body does not have a comparable system. So it's very difficult to measure oxygen because oxygen is down inside of red blood cells. I don't know if I use this analogy in our lectures yet, but your blood, in a way, is kind of like a boba tea. You know, boba teas, they've got those little balls of tapioca kind of starchy stuff, right? Well, oxygen is inside those little starchy things. If you were going to taste what is inside of those, you got to crunch it, right? Well, it doesn't crunch, but you got to chew it. However, the sugar, that's in the rest of the tea. So if I were to be drinking boba tea, I can constantly taste the sugar. But if I wanted to know, hey, what did they put in the center of these little boba things, I'd have to chew them. In this analogy, carbon dioxide in the blood is like CO2 in the plasma. Very easy for the chemoreceptor cells to detect it. Whereas oxygen in your red blood cells is like whatever's in the center of those little boba things, right? Difficult to measure. So since it's difficult to measure oxygen but easy to measure CO2, our system has been established so that it cares entirely about how much CO2 is there, and it really cares hardly at all about the amount of oxygen. So the reason that you can hold your breath as long as you can has to do with CO2, not oxygen. The reason you need to take your next breath has to do with CO2, not oxygen. CO2, by the way, that's the other name for carbon dioxide. So here's how it is. Now, your body really does care about how much oxygen, and not about, and CO2 is just kind of along for the ride. But your body knows that as oxygen is going down, CO2 levels are going up, right? So the higher the carbon dioxide is, then your body knows, uh-oh, oxygen must be low. I can measure the CO2. So what I'm going to set up as a system is that the higher the CO2 level has gone, the faster I will breathe. And it just so happens that the way our body works, that ends up making it so we get plenty of oxygen. All right? So one more time, breathing is not regulated by the amount of oxygen in your blood. It's not regulated by oxygen anywhere. It's regulated by levels of carbon dioxide and hydrogen ions, right? So why hydrogen ions? Well, it turns out that as CO2 levels build up in your blood, the more CO2 there is, the more acid there is in your blood. And that has to do with the scientific biochemical formula that I'm not going to make you memorize. So just promise me that you will memorize that higher CO2 means more acid means a lower pH. Now let's talk about what parts of your body are actually measuring all this stuff. Well, I was talking about the amount of sugar in the boba tea, right? So wouldn't it be great if it was chemoreceptors? And yes, it's chemoreceptors. Chemoreceptors detect chemicals. CO2 is a chemical. Oxygen, you could call a chemical too, right? Now, there are peripheral chemoreceptors that are out here outside of the central nervous system. The central chemoreceptors, those are in the central nervous system. They're right on and near our medulla oblongata, central nervous system. The central chemoreceptors are on the central nervous system. The peripheral chemoreceptors are out here in the carotid artery and here on the aorta, right? So the peripheral chemoreceptors are really close to where the baroreceptors, those mechanoreceptors that detect blood pressure, are. These guys, the more CO2 there is and the more acid there is, the faster they send off action potentials. Where are they sending that to? The medulla oblongata. If the medulla oblongata hears a very frequent, I always think of it as beeping, frequent action potentials from these chemoreceptors, the faster it hears the beeping, they're like, oh no, there's lots of CO2, breathe fast, right? And if the beeping goes really slow, then your medulla goes, we can wait a while until we take another breath, right? So peripheral and central chemoreceptors, both of them care about carbon dioxide and hydrogen ions. The more CO2, the more hydrogen ions, the faster you will breathe, the lower the number of hydrogen ions, which means the higher the pH, and the less CO2, the slower you will breathe. All right? So blood chemistry and respiratory rhythm. The rate and depth of breathing is adjusted to maintain the levels of pH right there in the sweet spot and the amount of CO2 right in the sweet spot. Do we have cells that detect oxygen? Yes, but not really, okay? So too much CO2 in the blood will cause the blood to have a low pH. There you go. High blood CO2 will increase the CO2 levels in the cerebrospinal fluid, and that will make the cerebrospinal fluid more acid as well. Both of these things together are going to stimulate how quickly you breathe, and this will be true even if you had enough oxygen in your blood. The opposite is also true. If you do not have enough CO2 in your blood, then that will suppress your respiratory rate. The reason that people can hold their breath longer if they hyperventilate beforehand has nothing to do with oxygen. Everyone always thinks that, even when I tell you that it's not true, and even when I tell you that the question is going to be on the exam. You hyperventilate, you don't put more oxygen in your blood. You just don't. Your blood has got 100% oxygen when it leaves the lungs. You don't do more than 100%, right? But when you hyperventilate, you get rid of carbon dioxide. Then it takes longer for it to get to that danger zone in your brain. And by the way, that feeling you have when you feel like, if I don't take another breath, if I don't stop holding my breath right now, I'm just going to die from lack of oxygen. You're not even close to running out of oxygen. Not even close. So when the world record for holding your breath underwater is, I think, more than 20 minutes. And any one of us, if we actually trained ourselves to, could easily hold our breath for 4 minutes. And why? Because holding your breath and needing to take another breath has nothing to do with oxygen. That moment when you feel like, if I don't take a breath, I'll pass out, you're not even close to passing out. Okay? So, knowing that, how would acidosis, which is a state where a patient's blood is too acid, but it's caused by something like, type 1 diabetes in kids, how would that affect their respiratory rate? Well, now you know that it is the pH and the amount of CO2 in the blood that causes you to breathe faster, so it would make the patient breathe faster. People with acidosis, because of type 1 diabetes, they will be breathing more quickly. And it's not because they need more oxygen. It's because our system is set up to measure CO2 and acid instead of oxygen. All righty. I think that is the end of our respiratory videos. So we will be moving on to our next subject.